The Twits, chapters 26 to the end. Chapter 26. The ravens swoop over. They had only just finished the job when the roly-poly bird came swooping in, screaming, "They're coming back! They're coming back!" Quickly, the birds flew back onto the roof of the house. The monkeys rushed into their cage and stood upside down, one on top of the other. A moment later, Mr. and Mrs. Twit came marching into the garden, each carrying a fearsome-looking gun. "I'm glad to see those monkeys still upside down," said Mr. Twit. "They're too stupid to do anything else," said Mrs. Twit. "Hey, look at all those cheeky birds still up there on the roof. Let's go inside and load our lovely new guns, and then it'll be bang, 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 and bird pie for supper." Just as Mr. and Mrs. Twit were about to enter the house, two black ravens swooped low over their heads. Each bird carried a paintbrush in its claw, and each paintbrush was smeared with sticky glue. As the ravens whizzed over, they brushed a streak of sticky glue onto the tops of Mr. and Mrs. Twitch's heads. They did it with the lightest touch. But even so, the Twits both felt it. "What was that?" cried Mrs. Twit. "Some beastly bird has dropped his dirty droppings on my head." "On mine too," shouted Mr. Twit. "I felt it! I felt it!" "Don't touch it!" cried Mrs. Twit. "You'll get it all over your hands. Come inside and we'll wash it off in the sink." "The filthy, dirty brutes!" yelled Mr. Twit. "I bet they did it on purpose. Just wait till I've loaded up my gun." Mrs. Twit got the key from under the doormat, where Muggle-Wump had carefully replaced it, and into the house they went. Chapter 27. The Twits are turned upside down. "What's this?" gasped Mr. Twit as they entered the living room. "What happened?" screamed Mrs. Twit. They stood in the middle of the room, looking up. All the furniture, the big table, the chairs, the sofa, the lamps, the little side tables, the cabinet with bottles of beer in it, the ornaments, the electric heater, the carpet, everything was stuck upside down to the ceiling. The pictures were upside down on the walls, and the floor they were standing on was absolutely bare. What's more, it had been painted white to look like the ceiling. "Look!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "That's the floor! The floor's up there! This is the ceiling! We're standing on the ceiling!" "We're upside down!" gasped Mr. Twit. "We must be upside down! We're standing on the ceiling, looking down at the floor!" "Oh, help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Help, help, help! I'm beginning to feel giddy." So am I, so am I!" cried Mr. Twit. "I don't like this one little bit." "We're upside down and all the blood's going to my head," screamed Mrs. Twit. "If we don't do something quickly, I shall die. I know I will." "I've got it," cried Mr. Twit. "I know what we'll do. We'll stand on our heads, and then, anyway, we'll be the right way up." So they stood on their heads, and of course, the moment their tops of their heads touched the floor, the sticky glue that the ravens had brushed on a few moments before did its job. They were stuck. They were pinned down, cemented, glued, fixed to the floorboards. Through a crack in the door, the monkeys watched. They jumped right out of their cage the moment the Twits had gone inside, and the roly-poly bird watched, and all the other birds flew in and out to catch a glimpse of this extraordinary sight. Chapter 29. The Monkeys Escape. That evening, Muggle-Wump and his family went up to the big wood on top of the hill, and in the tallest tree of all, they built a marvelous tree house. All the birds, especially the big ones, the crows and the rooks and the magpies, made nests around the tree house so that nobody could see it from the ground. "You can't stay up here forever, you know," said the roly-poly bird. "Why not?" asked Muggle-Wump. "It's a lovely place." "Just wait till winter comes," the roly-poly bird said. "Monkeys don't like cold weather, do they?" "They most certainly don't," cried Muggle-Wump. "Are the winters so very cold over here?" "It's all snow and ice," said the roly-poly bird. "Sometimes it's so cold a bird will wake up in the morning with his feet frozen up to the bough that he's been roosting on." "And what shall we do?" cried Mugglewump. "My family will all be deep freezed." "No, they won't," said the roly-poly bird, "because when the first leaves start falling from the trees in the autumn, you can all fly home to Africa with me." "Don't be ridiculous," Mugglewump said. "Monkeys can't fly." "You can sit on my back," said the roly-poly bird. "I shall take you one at a time. You will travel by the roly-poly superjet, and it won't cost you a penny." Chapter 29. The Twits Get the Shrinks. And down here in the horrid house, Mr. and Mrs. Twit are still stuck upside down to the floor of the living room. "It's all your fault," yelled Mr. Twit, thrashing his legs in the air. "You're the one, you ugly old cow, who went hopping around shouting, 'We're upside down, we're upside down.' And you're the one who said to stand on our head so we'd be the right way up, you whiskery old warthog," screamed Mrs. Twit. "Now we'll never get free. We're stuck here forever." "You may be stuck here forever," said Mr. Twit, "but not me. I'm going to get away." Mr. Twit wiggled and squirmed, and he squiggled and wormed, and he twisted and turned, and he choggled and churned, but the sticky glue held him to the floor just as tightly as it had once held the poor birds in the big dead tree. He was still as upside down as ever, standing on his head. But heads are not made to be stood upon. If you stand on your head for a very long time, a horrid thing happens, and this is where Mr. Twit got his biggest shock of all. With so much weight on it from up above, his head began to get squashed into his body. Quite soon it had disappeared completely, sunk out of sight into the fatty folds of his flabby neck. "I'm shrinking," burbled Mr. Twit. "So am I," cried Mrs. Twit. "Help me! Save me! Call a doctor!" yelled Mr. Twit. "I'm getting the dreaded shrinks!" And so he was. Mrs. Twit was getting the dreaded shrinks too. And this time it wasn't fake. It was the real thing. Their heads shrank into their necks, and then their necks began shrinking into their bodies, and their bodies began shrinking into their legs, and their legs began shrinking into their feet. And 1 week later, on a nice sunny afternoon, a man called Fred came round to read the gas meter. When nobody answered the door, Fred peeped into the house, and there he saw, on the floor of the living room, 2 bundles of old clothes, 2 pairs of shoes, and a walking stick. There was nothing more left in this world of Mr. and Mrs. Twit. And everyone, including Fred, shouted, "Hooray!"